At 11:23 a.m. on May 27, 1940, Private Owen Henry Pritchard stood in the open on the Dunkirk beach and watched a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka begin its dive toward him. The aircraft was at 4,000 feet and falling, its distinctive gull wings tilting forward, its fixed landing gear extended like the talons of a bird of prey. The siren mounted on the gear, the infamous Jericho trumpet, began to wail, a sound specifically designed to terrify the men below. The Stuka was coming for him, and Owen Pritchard had nothing but a broken Lee Enfield rifle and a Webley revolver to stop it. He was 19 years old, a coal miner's son from Pontypridd in South Wales, a private in the 2nd Battalion, Welsh Guards, and he had been fighting for 3 weeks without sleep, without reinforcements, without hope. The retreat had begun on May 10th when the Germans had launched their attack through the Ardennes. The British Expeditionary Force had been positioned in Belgium, waiting for an assault that everyone expected to come through the Low Countries, the same route the Kaiser's armies had taken in 1914. But the Wehrmacht had learned from history. While a diversionary force pinned the Allies in Belgium, the main German thrust had punched through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, and begun racing toward the English Channel. The speed of the advance had been terrifying. German panzers covered 50 miles in a single day, slicing through French defenses that had been designed to stop the methodical infantry assaults of the First World War. The Allies tried to counterattack, tried to establish defensive lines, tried to do anything to slow the gray tide rolling across France. Nothing worked. By May 20th, German tanks had reached the coast at Abbeville, cutting the BEF off from the rest of France, trapping 400,000 men against the sea. The Welsh Guards had been in the thick of it from the beginning. They had fought a series of brutal rearguard actions, holding crossroads and bridges, while the rest of the army retreated, buying time with blood. Pritchard had watched his battalion shrink from 800 men to fewer than 300, had buried friends in shallow graves that the Germans would probably plow over, had learned what it meant to fight without hope of victory. The British Expeditionary Force was collapsing around him. The Germans had broken through at Sedan, had raced across France faster than anyone thought possible, had trapped 400,000 Allied soldiers against the English Channel with no way out. The evacuation at Dunkirk was underway, but the Luftwaffe owned the skies, and the Stukas were turning the beaches into a slaughterhouse. The rifle in Pritchard's hands had been damaged 2 days earlier when a German artillery shell had landed close enough to knock him unconscious and bend the barrel of his Lee Enfield at a 15-degree angle. The weapon could still fire, technically, but it was impossible to aim. The bent barrel sent bullets veering wildly off course, useless for hitting anything at range. He had kept it anyway, because a soldier without a rifle wasn't a soldier, and because throwing it away felt like giving up. The Webley revolver was his sergeant's. Sergeant Di Evans had been killed that morning, machine-gunned by a German fighter while trying to organize the men for evacuation. Evans had been more than a sergeant to Pritchard. He had been a mentor, a surrogate father, the man who had shaped a raw recruit into something resembling a soldier. He was from Merthyr Tydfil, had worked the same colliery as Pritchard's father, had known Owen since he was a boy, running through the streets of Pontypridd. When Owen had turned 18 and announced he was enlisting, it was Evans who had convinced him to join the Guards, instead of following his da into the mines. "The mines will kill you slow," Evans had said. "Take 30 years to fill your lungs with dust and finish you off. The army might kill you fast, but at least you'll see something of the world first." Evans had been right about seeing the world. He had been right about a lot of things. He had taught Pritchard how to shoot, how to march, how to survive on nothing but tea and spite. He had taught him how to lead men, how to keep them alive when everything was trying to kill them. He had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done while the fear screamed at you to run. The German fighter had come in low, strafing the beach, and Evans had been standing in the open, waving his arms, trying to direct men toward the evacuation points. The Bf 109 had caught him with a burst that nearly cut him in half. He had fallen where he stood, and Pritchard had crawled to him, had held his hand while the life drained out of him, had listened to his final words. "Get home, boyo. Get home and live." Now Evans was dead, his body lying face down in the sand 20 yards away, and Pritchard had taken his revolver because it seemed wrong to leave it. 6 rounds in the Webley, maybe 3 usable shots from the bent rifle before it jammed completely, and a Stuka diving at 400 miles per hour, carrying 2 110-pound bombs and twin 7.92mm machine guns that could tear a man apart before he even heard the shots. The mathematics of survival said Pritchard should run. The beach was littered with craters from previous bombing runs, and any one of them would provide better cover than standing in the open like an idiot. The men around him were already scattering, diving for whatever shelter they could find, pressing themselves into the sand as if they could disappear into it. Running was the smart thing to do. Running was what training demanded. Pritchard did not run. Later, when people asked him why, he would struggle to explain it. He would talk about exhaustion, about the accumulated rage of 3 weeks of retreat, about watching his friends die one by one while the Germans seemed to kill without consequence. He would talk about Sergeant Evans lying dead in the sand, about the sound of the Jericho trumpet screaming in his ears, about something breaking inside him that made fear irrelevant. But the truth was simpler than any of that. He was tired of being hunted. He wanted to hunt back. The Stuka was at 3,000 feet now, its dive steepening, the siren growing louder. The Junkers Ju-87 was not the fastest aircraft in the Luftwaffe, nor the most heavily armed, but it was the most feared. The Germans had designed it specifically to terrorize ground troops, had added the Jericho trumpet siren purely for psychological effect. The scream of a diving Stuka was burned into the memory of every soldier who had faced one. A sound that haunted dreams, that made men freeze in place, that turned disciplined troops into cowering animals. The aircraft's accuracy was legendary. A skilled Stuka pilot could place a bomb within 30 feet of his target, diving at angles as steep as 80 degrees, using a sophisticated automatic pullout system that recovered the aircraft even if the pilot blacked out from G-forces. The planes had shattered Polish cavalry, had broken French defensive lines, had destroyed bridges and supply depots and ammunition dumps with surgical precision. And now one was diving on Owen Pritchard, and there was nowhere to run. Pritchard could see the pilot in the cockpit, could see the bombs hanging beneath the wings, could see the muzzle flashes as the forward machine guns opened fire. The MG-17 machine guns fired 7.92mm rounds at 1,200 per minute, and the pilot was walking his fire across the beach, searching for targets, killing men who had survived everything the Germans had thrown at them, only to die in the sand within sight of the rescue ships. Sand erupted in a line across the beach, marching toward him, and still he did not move. He raised the bent rifle to his shoulder. The first shot went wide as he knew it would. The bent barrel sent the bullet spiraling somewhere to the left of the diving aircraft. Harmless, useless. But firing the rifle wasn't the point. The point was to make the pilot see him, to make the German focus on the single figure standing upright on the beach, to draw the Stuka's attention away from the hundreds of men cowering in the sand. It worked. The pilot adjusted his dive, bringing the aircraft's nose directly toward Pritchard, the machine gun still firing, the line of impacts walking across the sand toward the Welsh private who refused to hide. Pritchard fired the rifle again. Another wild shot, another miss. The rifle's action jammed on the third attempt, the bent barrel finally defeating the weapon's mechanism. He threw it aside and drew the Webley. The Stuka was at 1,500 feet, 10 seconds from bomb release. The machine gun rounds were falling close now, close enough that Pritchard could feel the impacts through the soles of his boots, close enough that sand was spraying against his legs. He raised the revolver, aimed at the diving aircraft, and began to fire. The Webley Point, 4.55, was a powerful handgun, designed to stop a man at close range with a single heavy bullet. It was not designed to shoot down aircraft. The effective range was perhaps 50 yards against a human target. Against an aircraft diving at 400 miles per hour from 1,500 feet away, the odds of hitting anything vital were essentially zero. Pritchard fired anyway. If you want to see how a Welsh private with a revolver brought down a Stuka dive bomber over the beaches of Dunkirk, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Pritchard. The first round from the Webley missed. So did the second. The Stuka was growing larger in his vision, filling the sky, the siren screaming so loud that it seemed to drown out thought itself. The pilot was committed now, locked into his dive, the bombs ready to release, the machine guns still spitting fire. Pritchard fired the third round at 800 feet, the fourth at 600, the fifth at 400. The Stuka's engine coughed. It was a small sound, almost lost in the chaos of the siren and the machine guns and the explosions rippling across the beach. But Pritchard heard it. He saw the aircraft wobble, saw a thin stream of smoke begin to trail from the engine cowling, saw the propeller's rhythm change from a smooth blur to something ragged and uneven. The sixth round, the last round, hit the Stuka at approximately 300 feet. Pritchard would never know exactly where the bullet struck. The Webley's heavy point .455 caliber slug was tumbling by the time it reached the aircraft, its trajectory warped by distance and air resistance. But somewhere in that mass of metal and fuel and German engineering, the bullet found something vital. The Stuka's engine died. The silence was stunning. One moment, the siren was screaming. The machine guns were hammering. The entire world was noise and terror. The next moment, there was only the whistle of wind over wings and the sound of 400,000 men holding their breath. The pilot tried to recover. Pritchard could see him wrestling with the controls, fighting to pull the aircraft out of its dive, struggling to restart the dead engine. At 300 feet, he had perhaps 3 seconds to level off before impact. He needed 5. The mathematics were final. The Stuka hit the beach 200 yards from where Pritchard stood. The impact was surprisingly quiet, a thump rather than an explosion, the aircraft burying itself nose first in the soft sand. The fuel tanks ruptured but did not ignite immediately. For a long moment, the Stuka simply sat there, its tail pointing at the sky, its wings crumpled, its propeller bent into abstract sculpture. Then the fire started. Pritchard watched the aircraft burn. He watched the flames climb from the engine to the cockpit, watched the smoke rise into the morning sky, watched the funeral pyre of a German pilot who had come to kill him and had died instead. He felt nothing. The rage that had driven him to stand in the open, to challenge a dive bomber with a pistol, had burned out, leaving only emptiness. He thought about the pilot. A young man, probably, not much older than Pritchard himself. Someone who had been trained to fly, who had been sent to France to win a war, who had probably believed in what he was doing. Now he was dead, burning in the wreckage of his aircraft, and Pritchard had killed him with a pistol, with 6 rounds fired into the sky by a coal miner's son who had never expected to hit anything. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like one more death in a war full of deaths. One more body to add to the thousands already scattered across France and Belgium and the beaches of Dunkirk. The pilot had been trying to kill him, and Pritchard had killed him first, and that was all. No glory, no triumph, just survival. Around him, men were emerging from their craters, staring at the burning Stuka, staring at the Welsh private who was still standing with an empty revolver in his hand. Someone was shouting something, but Pritchard couldn't hear the words. His ears were ringing from the gunfire, from the siren, from the explosion of his own heartbeat. A hand grabbed his shoulder. He turned to find Lieutenant Gwyn Hughes, the only surviving officer from his company, staring at him with an expression that mixed disbelief with something approaching awe. "Pritchard," Hughes said, "did you just shoot down a Stuka with a bloody pistol?" Pritchard looked at the revolver in his hand. 6 chambers, all empty. He looked at the burning aircraft, at the smoke rising into the sky, at the impossible thing he had just done. "I think so, sir," he said. "I think I did." The evacuation continued around them. The Stukas would return. They always returned. But for this moment, on this stretch of beach, there was something like peace. Men who had been cowering in craters minutes earlier were standing now, looking at the burning aircraft, looking at Pritchard, passing the story from mouth to mouth. The Welsh private who shot down a Stuka with a pistol, standing in the open like a madman. Lieutenant Hughes sent Pritchard to the rear with the next group scheduled for evacuation. Not as a reward exactly. There were no rewards at Dunkirk, only survival. But because the lieutenant recognized that Pritchard had done something that deserved acknowledgement, even if no one quite understood what it was. The private had stood when others had hidden. He had fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. That counted for something. Pritchard reached the mole at 3:47 p.m., joining the long queue of soldiers waiting for rescue. The destroyers and civilian boats were arriving in waves, loading men as quickly as they could, racing back across the channel before the Luftwaffe could find them. The wait was hours long, and during that time, the Stukas came twice more, bombing and strafing the exposed soldiers. Pritchard did not have a weapon anymore. He simply stood in line, watching the aircraft dive, waiting for his turn to die or his turn to escape. His turn to escape came at 9:15 p.m. He boarded a paddle steamer named the Medway Queen, a pleasure boat from the Thames that had been pressed into service for the evacuation. The ship was already carrying twice her rated capacity, men packed into every available space, wounded soldiers groaning on the decks, the smell of blood and cordite and exhaustion filling the air. The crossing took 4 hours. The channel was calm, a mercy since the overloaded paddle steamer would have capsized in heavy seas. But the night was full of danger. German E-boats prowled the waters, looking for rescue ships to torpedo. Luftwaffe bombers flew overhead, silhouetted against the stars, searching for targets. The Medway Queen's captain ran without lights, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, trusting luck and God to see them through. Pritchard spent the crossing sitting on the deck with his back against the railing, watching the fires burning on the French coast, watching the occasional flash of German bombs falling on the beaches they had left behind. He did not sleep. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Stuka diving, heard the siren screaming, felt the revolver buck in his hand as he fired into the sky. The man beside him was a corporal from the Royal Engineers, a Londoner named Tommy Wilson, who had spent 3 days building and destroying bridges as the BEF retreated. Wilson had a flask of whiskey that he passed to Pritchard without a word, and they sat in silence, drinking and watching the French coast recede into darkness. "I heard what you did," Wilson said eventually. "On the beach, with the Stuka." Pritchard said nothing. "Bloody impossible, that. Shooting down a plane with a pistol." Wilson took a pull from his flask. "But I saw the wreck, saw the hole in the engine cowling. Something brought that bastard down, and the only one shooting was you." "Lucky shot," Pritchard said. "Lucky." Wilson laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "Mate, if that was luck, you used up your whole life supply in one go." They landed at Dover at 1:30 a.m. on May 28th. Women from the WVS were waiting on the docks with tea and sandwiches, and Pritchard accepted both without tasting either. He was processed through a receiving station, given a medical check that declared him physically uninjured, and loaded onto a train bound for a reassembly camp in Hampshire. The story of the Stuka traveled faster than he did. By the time Pritchard reached camp, the tale had already spread through the returning soldiers. Someone had seen it happen, had told someone else, who had told someone else, and the story had grown with each telling. The Welsh private who shot down a dive bomber with a pistol. Some versions said he had shot down 2 Stukas, some said 3. Some said he had done it while wounded, or while carrying a fallen comrade, or while reciting the Lord's Prayer in Welsh. The truth was strange enough without embellishment, but truth rarely survived contact with soldiers who had just escaped death. They needed heroes. They needed stories of defiance. They needed to believe that one man could stand against the German war machine and win. Pritchard gave no interviews. When officers asked him about the incident, he described it simply, without drama. The diving aircraft, the bent rifle, the sergeant's revolver, the 6 shots fired into the sky. He did not claim to have aimed carefully, did not claim any particular skill. He had fired because firing was better than hiding, and one of his bullets had found something vital. That was all. The Army awarded him the military medal. The citation praised his exceptional courage and coolness under fire, and noted that his action had materially contributed to the morale of soldiers in his vicinity during a period of extreme danger. It did not mention that he had shot down a Stuka with a pistol. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to acknowledge his bravery without making claims that might seem impossible. Lieutenant Hughes wrote a separate letter recommending Pritchard for the Victoria Cross. The letter described the incident in detail, argued that Pritchard's action represented the highest traditions of the British Army, and requested that his bravery be recognized with the nation's highest honor. Hughes wrote that he had personally witnessed the event, that multiple other soldiers could corroborate the account, that there could be no doubt about what had occurred. The recommendation was denied. A review board in London, staffed by officers who had not been at Dunkirk, who had not seen what the beaches looked like, who had not felt the terror of the Jericho trumpet screaming in their ears, determined that while Pritchard's conduct was commendable, there was insufficient evidence to confirm that his pistol fire had actually caused the Stuka's crash. The aircraft might have suffered mechanical failure. The pilot might have been killed by debris from an earlier attack. The timing might have been coincidence. The board's reasoning was not entirely unreasonable. The odds of a pistol shot bringing down an aircraft were astronomical. The Webley's effective range was perhaps 50 yards. The Stuka had been hundreds of feet away, moving at tremendous speed. From a purely statistical standpoint, it should have been impossible, and military awards, especially the Victoria Cross, required certainty. But statistics did not account for what the men on that beach had seen. They had watched Pritchard stand up when everyone else was hiding. They had watched him fire 6 shots into the sky. They had watched the Stuka's engine fail seconds after the last shot. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Something in those 6 bullets had found something vital. Pritchard didn't argue. He had been there. He knew what he had done. Whether anyone believed him was their concern, not his. The Welsh Guards were rebuilt over the following months, absorbing replacements from training depots across Britain, preparing for the day when they would return to France. Pritchard was promoted to Lance Corporal, then Sergeant, rising through the ranks on a combination of combat experience and the quiet competence that had kept him alive when so many others had died. He became known as a soldier who could be relied upon in crisis. Not flashy, not heroic in the way that earned headlines, but steady. A man who kept his head when others lost theirs, who made good decisions under fire, who brought his men back alive when other sergeants brought back body bags. His commanding officers noted his ability to remain calm in situations that would have broken most men. They did not know about Dunkirk, about the Stuka, about the moment when Owen Pritchard had discovered that he was capable of facing death without flinching. He fought in North Africa, landing with Operation Torch in November 1942. The Desert War was different from France. Vast open spaces, tanks dueling across the sand, a war of maneuver rather than the static trench fighting of the Western Front. Pritchard adapted, as he had adapted to everything the war threw at him. He fought at Kasserine Pass, where the Americans learned the hard way what German panzers could do. He fought at El Ghoutar, where Patton's forces began their transformation into a fighting force that could match the Wehrmacht. He fought in Italy, slogging through the mud at Anzio, where the Allies landed behind German lines and then spent 4 months trapped on a beachhead that felt uncomfortably like Dunkirk. He watched friends die in the same grinding way they had died in France. Artillery, snipers, the random mathematics of war that took good men and left others untouched. He stopped making friends after Anzio. It was easier that way. He fought in Normandy, landing on Gold Beach on D-Day, returning to France 4 years after he had left it on the Medway Queen. The beaches were different, sand instead of shingle, cliffs instead of dunes. But the feeling was the same. Men dying in the surf, officers falling in the first minutes, the desperate scramble to get off the killing ground and into cover. Pritchard had been through it before. He knew what to do. He fought until the German surrender in May 1945, surviving 5 years of war without a serious wound, carrying the military medal ribbon on his chest and the memory of a burning Stuka in his mind. He went home to Pontypridd in August 1945. The colliery where his father had worked was still running, and Pritchard could have had a job there if he wanted one. He didn't want one. He had spent too many years underground in a different way, buried in foxholes and trenches and the rubble of bombed-out buildings. He wanted to work in the open air, under the sky, where he could see what was coming for him. He took a job with the Forestry Commission, planting trees in the valleys where the coal mines had stripped the land bare. It was hard work, physical work, the kind of labor that left him too tired at night to dream about the war. He planted thousands of trees over the following decades, oak and ash and beech and pine, watching them grow from saplings into forests, watching the scarred Welsh hillsides turn green again. The work suited him. There was something healing about putting things into the ground instead of burying them, about creating life instead of taking it. He worked in all weathers, in the rain that seemed to fall half the days of the Welsh year, in the winter cold that reminded him of the Ardennes, in the summer heat that was nothing compared to North Africa. He became brown and weathered and strong, the lean muscle of his army days hardening into the dense strength of a working man. His foreman learned not to ask about the war. Pritchard would talk about the army, about the places he had seen, about the friends he had made, but never about the fighting itself. When other veterans gathered at the pub to trade war stories, Pritchard would listen, but rarely contribute. He had done things he didn't know how to describe, had felt things he didn't want to remember. The trees were simpler. The trees didn't ask questions. He married a woman named Bronwyn Davies in 1947, a teacher from Aberdare who had lost her first fiancé at El Alamein. She was dark-haired and sharp-tongued, with a laugh that could fill a room and a temper that could empty one. She had met Pritchard at a church social, had danced with him twice, and had told her sister afterward that she was going to marry him. Her sister had asked what made her so certain. "Because he's broken," Bronwyn had said, "and I know how to mend things." She understood silence. Understood the things that men carried home from war, understood that some question should never be asked. When Pritchard woke sweating from nightmares he would never describe, she held him without asking what he had seen. When the anniversary of Dunkirk came around each May, and he grew quiet and distant, she gave him space without complaint. She knew there were parts of her husband that the war had claimed, and she loved what remained. They had 3 children, David, Megan, and little Gwyn, named for Lieutenant Hughes, who had recognized Pritchard's bravery on the beach at Dunkirk. Each child was raised knowing their father was a veteran, knowing he had medals in a box in the closet, knowing that whatever had happened in the war was not something to ask about. They learned to read his moods, to give him room on the bad days, to treasure the good days when he would laugh and play and seem almost like a man who had never seen combat. Hughes had died at Arnhem in 1944, leading a hopeless charge against German armor. Pritchard had learned about it months later, in a letter from a mutual friend who had survived the disaster. He had not cried. He had forgotten how to cry by then, but he had named his youngest son after the man who had seen something worth honoring in a coal miner's boy with an empty revolver. Pritchard never returned to Dunkirk. The French government invited him several times for anniversaries and commemorations and ceremonies honoring the men who had escaped the beaches. He declined every invitation. He did not want to see the sand where Sergeant Evans had died, did not want to walk the ground where he had stood firing into the sky, did not want to remember what it had felt like to be 19 years old and certain he was going to die. In 1985, a military historian named Dr. Andrew Blackwood tracked Pritchard down while researching a book about the Dunkirk evacuation. Blackwood had found the military medal citation, had located Hughes's Victoria Cross recommendation in the archives, had pieced together the story of the Welsh private and the Stuka from multiple accounts. He drove to Pontypridd, sat in Pritchard's kitchen, and asked him to describe what had happened. Pritchard was 64 years old then, retired from the Forestry Commission, his hair gray and his hands gnarled from decades of planting trees. Bronwyn made tea while her husband spoke, listening to a story she had never heard in 38 years of marriage. "The thing people don't understand," Pritchard said slowly, "is that I wasn't being brave. Brave is when you're scared, and you do it anyway. I wasn't scared anymore. I was past scared. I was so tired, so angry, so sick of watching my friends die while the Germans killed us from the sky. I just didn't care anymore. I stood up because lying down felt like giving up. I shot at that bloody Stuka because I wanted to hit something, to hurt something, to make them feel what we were feeling." "But you actually hit it," Blackwood said. "You brought down an aircraft with a pistol. The odds of that." "I know the odds." Pritchard shook his head. "I've thought about it every day for 45 years. 6 shots from a Webley at a diving aircraft. The chances of hitting anything vital were practically 0. But I did hit it. Something I fired found something that mattered, and that Stuka went down." He paused. "I used to think it was luck. Now I'm not so sure. Now I think maybe it was something else." "What?" Pritchard was quiet for a long moment. "I think maybe the universe rewards people who refuse to give up. I think maybe there's something, call it God, call it fate, call it whatever you like. That watches when a man stands up instead of lying down. That gives him a chance he doesn't deserve. He shrugged. Or maybe it was just luck. Maybe I'm an old man looking for meaning in randomness. I don't know. I just know I pulled the trigger, and the Stuka fell, and I'm still here to talk about it. Blackwood published his book in 1987. A full chapter covered Pritchard's action at Dunkirk, including photographs of the beach and excerpts from Hughes's recommendation letter. The chapter was titled 6 Shots at the Sky. Owen Henry Pritchard died on February 14, 2003, at the age of 82. Pneumonia, the doctor said, complicated by the lung damage that decades of work in Welsh weather had caused. He passed at home, in the cottage he and Bronwyn had shared for 56 years, with his children and grandchildren gathered around him. At the funeral, held at St. Catherine's Church in Pontypridd, his oldest son David spoke about what his father had meant to him. He talked about the tree planting, about the quiet patience his father had shown in teaching him to work with his hands. He talked about the silence, about the stories his father had never told, about the weight that all the Dunkirk survivors had carried. And then, at the end, he talked about the Stuka. Dad never thought of himself as a hero, David said. When people asked about the war, he would change the subject. When they asked about Dunkirk, he would talk about the friends he lost, not the German plane he shot down. But I found something in his papers after he passed, a letter he wrote to Mum in 1947, before they were married, trying to explain what had happened on that beach. David unfolded a yellowed piece of paper and began to read. I stood up because I couldn't stand lying down anymore. 3 weeks of running, 3 weeks of watching my mates die, and I just couldn't do it anymore. The Stuka was coming, and I knew I was going to die, and I decided that if I was going to die, I was going to die on my feet. I was going to die fighting. I was going to make them work for it. What happened next? The Stuka going down. I still don't understand it. I fired 6 shots into the sky, and one of them found something that mattered. It shouldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. But it did. And I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of that miracle. David folded the letter. Dad spent the rest of his life planting trees. He said once that he was trying to put something back into the world to balance out what he had taken. I don't know if he ever felt like he succeeded, but I know this. The forests he planted are still growing. The land he healed is still green. And the story of what he did at Dunkirk, the man who refused to lie down, who stood up and fought back with nothing but a pistol and a broken rifle, that story is still being told. 6 shots, 1 Stuka. A man who refused to give up. The Webley revolver that Owen Pritchard used at Dunkirk was returned to Sergeant Evans's family after the war. It remained in their possession until 1998, when Evans's grandchildren donated it to the Imperial War Museum in London. The museum display notes that the revolver was reportedly used to bring down a German aircraft during the Dunkirk evacuation, a careful phrasing that acknowledges the story without confirming the impossible. But the men who were there needed no confirmation. They saw Owen Pritchard stand up when they were hiding. They saw him fire into the sky when they were praying for deliverance. They saw the Stuka fall. That was enough. That would always be enough. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.